It all started with a mistake that shouldn't have happened. A medium-sized European bank, one of those that almost nobody knows but which moves billions behind the curtains, accidentally sent an internal report to a corporate client. The document was marked with 3 words that weren't in any official glossary of the financial sector: unbacked, liquidity, photon, 12. Under normal conditions, this would just be another poorly named technical file, but not when the person who received it was an independent auditor with 22 years of experience in the European banking system. He knew exactly what those words meant, and, more importantly, what they concealed. Before we continue, tell me one thing. Which country are you watching this from right now? Because what you're about to discover is not theory, it is not an exaggeration, and it is not fiction. It is the mechanism that defines how much your money is worth and how it loses value without you noticing. The accidental report explained something simple and devastating. For every 1 unit of real money you deposit in a bank, that bank is authorized to create 9 other units of digital money that do not physically exist. This is how the fractional reserve system works. If you put $100 in an account, the bank doesn't keep 100, it keeps 10, and the other 90 are born from a click, a calculation, and a silent permission given by central banks around the world. 90% of modern economy money is created out of nothing, and this is legal. But the report contained something even stranger. A second attached document, unsigned, without a header, and without an author. Only 2 letters in the corner, HF. The text described a meeting held in Geneva in 2018 between 5 people who should not have been in the same room. It was the first clue to Operation Photon, a clandestine network composed of experts who operate behind the scenes to ensure that this financial trick continues to work without the public ever realizing it. The names were known among a few, but unknown to almost the entire planet. Sir Adrian Cole, former shadow director of the BIS, Mei Tanaka, a Japanese economist specializing in synthetic liquidity, Victor Reinhardt, former CIA financial analyst with a buried past, Helena Moreau, a Bank of England consultant who advocated infinite liquidity as a policy, and Otto Mertens, a German banker heir to post-war treaties. 5 names, 5 origins, 1 secret: to keep money operating as a controlled illusion. The auditor continued reading, trying to understand how that parallel document had been attached to a common report. The text described how Operation Photon monitored, manipulated, and corrected liquidity flows in different countries. Stability depends on blind trust, one of the paragraphs said. It was as if the entire global financial system depended on the public's ignorance, not out of malice, but because the mechanism itself only works if no one notices the trick. If people understood that 90% of the money doesn't exist, mass withdrawals could happen, and that would destroy banks in days. But the most disturbing part came at the end of the first page. The real risk is not in the money created, but in who understands the mechanism. This sentence was underlined twice. The auditor, silent for minutes, opened the second attachment. It was shorter, more direct, and more dangerous. It contained graphs showing that monetary multiplication was not just banking. Mathematics, it was a political instrument. Every time a bank creates money that doesn't exist, the population's purchasing power decreases. Inflation is not an accident. It is a structural byproduct of fractional reserve itself. And while everyone blames governments, wars, and crises, the truth is that the global banking system was built to silently generate inflation. The last page of the document had only 1 sentence. The money you believe you have is only a promise, and promises have no backing. Next to this sentence, a handwritten note that seemed to have been added later. Photon 12, activate if the information leaks. And then the auditor realized what that meant. There was a secret protocol to deal with anyone who discovered the trick of monetary multiplication, a protocol involving the 5 members of Operation Photon, a protocol prepared to be triggered whenever someone got too close to the truth. The segment ends right here, with the auditor staring at the pages and wondering how many other people in the world had already realized the forbidden math that sustains the entire modern economy. And, most importantly, who really controls this trick and why? Fractional reserve was not born alone. It was shaped, protected, and perfected by a network that never appeared in economics books. A network that does not hold political office, does not give interviews, does not appear in international forums, and does not sign treaties, but influences all of them. This network is known only to those who work in the grey zones of the global financial system. Operation Photon. The auditor, after receiving the accidental document, found a discrete reference at the end of the digital folder. Preparatory report. Photon T0. This was the source document, the birth of the operation, and its narrative began in 1998 at a meeting held in a Swiss hotel whose conference room was not on the building's floor plan. It is there that the 5 names mentioned in the document, Sir Adrian Cole, May Tanaka, Victor Reinhardt, Helena Moreau, and Otto Mertens, met for the first time. Sir Adrian Cole, the librarian, was considered the operation's brain. Former BIS director, he had access to the oldest documents of the international banking system, papers that showed how, during crises and wars, central banks discovered they could multiply money without causing immediate collapse, as long as the public never understood the process. Cole knew that fractional reserve was not a policy. It was a calculated trick, and his role was to ensure that this trick remained invisible. May Tanaka brought another essential piece. A brilliant economist from the Bank of Japan, she had developed synthetic liquidity models, algorithms that calculated how far monetary multiplication could go without causing panic in the markets. According to Operation Photon reports, Tanaka could predict the emotional reaction of ordinary investors with frightening accuracy. For her, inflation was not a problem. It was a tool. Inflation is the camouflage for our trick, one of the notes attached to the document stated. Victor Reinhardt was the shadow link. A former CIA analyst who worked in clandestine financial operations, his function was to detect leaks, curious journalists, persistent auditors, independent economists with questions too many. His internal report stated, "We are not hiding a crime, we are hiding the architecture." What he meant by that would become clear in the following pages. Helena Moreau was the one who spoke the language of central banks. Her career at the Bank of England placed her at tables where real decisions were made, tables that do not appear in press conferences. Moreau advocated the idea that the world needed to operate with unlimited liquidity. If the public believed that money was scarce, the system would lock up. If they believed it was infinite, the economy would become chaotic. But if they believed in a comfortable middle ground, banks could continue to create money out of nothing without raising suspicion. Finally, Otto Mertens was the operation's European pillar. His grandfather had participated in post-war financial negotiations when the modern system began to emerge. Mertens inherited not only fortune, but access to documents dating back to the first experiments with monetary multiplication. My grandfather used to say that money was born as an invention, not as metal, Mertens wrote in an internal report. For him, the public only believes in the value of currency because no one has the courage to ask where it comes from. The Photon 00 document showed that these 5 names came together to create something very simple, an invisible shield, a structure capable of ensuring that banks could continue to multiply money indefinitely, without attracting public attention, without generating panic, without provoking political resistance. The shield had 3 main functions: narrative camouflage, prevent the public from associating inflation with fractional reserve, global synchronization, ensure that central banks worldwide adopted similar policies, noise neutralization, anyone who got too close to the mechanism was diverted, discredited, or silenced. The report provided practical examples of this shield in action. Economists considered independent, who actually received indirect funding from international banks to divert the narrative. Technical documents that were published with language so complex that no ordinary citizen could understand, and media campaigns that reinforced the idea that inflation is inevitable, as if it were a law of nature. But the most disturbing page was the one explaining why fractional reserve was never exposed. It stated, if the public understands that money is born out of nothing, the system collapses from emotional collapse before economic collapse. The last sentence of the report made clear the core of Operation Photon. Our job is not to protect the banks, it is to protect the belief. The auditor, upon realizing the scope of this network, understood that fractional reserve was not just a trick, it was a global architecture sustained by experts who never appear on newspaper covers, people whose existence is officially denied, but who silently move trillions. And the segment ends here with the inevitable question: if this network controls the money you earn, save and use every day, who controls this network? The auditor knew he had found something big, but he only realized the real gravity when he opened the densest folder in the package. Derivative files, Photon 09. There were documents that should never exist outside of underground vaults at the BIS, the Bank of England, and Asian central banks. The kind of paper that is not sent by email, does not appear in minutes, and cannot be publicly cited without destroying careers or ruining entire economies. The first document had a simple yet devastating title: Multiplication. Mechanism, Level 5, Restricted Use. And right on the first line, the auditor gasped. The population must believe that deposits represent the physical existence of money. This belief is fundamental. It was the first time he had seen this admission on official paper. For Operation Photon, money did not exist, the belief is what existed. And when belief is more important than the system itself, everything becomes psychological, not economic. The next document was even more shocking. It was called Unbacked Liquidity Cycle Photon Demonstration. It was a diagram showing exactly how 90% of modern money is born. Initial deposit, $1 real, permitted loan, 9 digitally created dollars, repeated chain loans, up to 81 additional dollars, public circulation, $91, real backing, $1. On the footer, there was a handwritten sentence in blue ink, clearly added by someone linked to the original operation. It's not multiplication, it's continuous simulation. This changed absolutely everything. Fractional reserve, according to this document, was not an accounting trick. It was a deliberate simulation of economic abundance. A simulation that only works because no one questions its origin. The auditor turned the page and found something that made his stomach churn. A list of silent interventions carried out by Operation Photon between 2002 and 2019. They were not described as financial operations, but as narrative corrections, that is, actions to prevent the population from connecting inflation, indebtedness, and loss of purchasing power to the monetary multiplication mechanism. Among the listed interventions, 2008, influence economic articles to blame the crisis exclusively on excessive risk, without mentioning fractional reserve. 2010, discreetly fund academic studies that normalize the use of quantitative easing. 2016, adjust the circulation of inflation headlines to maintain a neutral emotional zone. 2018, intervene in independent consultancies that tried to associate price increases with liquidity expansion. The auditor could hardly believe what he was reading. These were not theories, these were not rumors, these were internal reports with dates, locations, and individuals responsible: Cole, Tanaka, Moreau, Reinhardt, and Mertens. The next document was the most dangerous of all: Protocol of Silence, red category. The word red was written in a different font. as if someone had made a point of marking it, and below it, a simple definition applied when individuals or entities extrapolate the investigative tolerance zone on unbacked liquidity. It was a manual of actions, cold, technical, impersonal. Among them, investigation redirection, public discrediting, creation of technical complexity to confuse analysts, reverse auditing, auditing the auditor, unexpected legal movement, and, in extreme cases, institutional replacement. The auditor felt a chill spread down his spine. That folder explained exactly how economists, professors, journalists, and even politicians were kept away from the topic of fractional reserve, not by explicit persecution, but by bureaucratic processes, technical noise, confusing reports, and busy agendas. Operation Photon never silenced anyone directly. It just made it impossible to continue investigating. The final document was the shortest and the most disturbing. It was called Photon 12 Activation, and it listed the criteria that should trigger an internal alert. Unsolicited investigation into the origin of liquidity, associations between inflation and fractional reserve, discovery of uncatalogued historical documents, public linkage between monetary multiplication and purchasing power, independent auditor reporting anomalous behavior in bank flows. And then the last line, if Photon 12 is activated, neutralize before the population comprehends the mechanism. That was it. Operation Photon existed to protect a secret so big that if revealed, it could collapse confidence in the modern financial system. And confidence, according to those documents, was the true backing of the world. The segment ends here, with the auditor realizing that unintentionally he had triggered exactly the trigger the document described, Photon.12. When the auditor finished reading the red protocol and the Photon 12 activation, he realized for the first time in his life that the problem was not with the banks, the governments, or the economic crises. It was with the very mechanism that creates money. And this is where everything connects to what you live today, right now, as you watch this. Most people think that the money they have in their account physically exists in vaults, printers, or central bank reserves, but it doesn't. 90% of modern money is just a number, created, multiplied, and pushed into the economy as if it were real. This money is not born from work, production, or wealth. It is born from loans. And with every loan created, the currency you hold silently loses value. This loss does not appear as a tax. It does not appear as a discount. It does not appear as an official notice. It appears as inflation. Milk goes up, rent goes up, fuel goes up, everything goes up, less your salary. The auditor found a graph within the folder that brutally translated exactly this. For every 1 unit you earn, the system creates 9 new invisible units. And the consequence of this is arithmetic. If money increases but products do not increase, in the same proportion, prices rise, and the one who pays the bill for monetary multiplication is not the banks, it's you, always you. Another document explained how fractional reserve creates a false sense of prosperity. When you take out a loan, buy a car, finance a property, or use a credit card, everything seems like part of a functional system, but it is not. It is a system that pushes debt into the future while printing invisible money in the present. And the more people finance, the more money is created. The more money is created, the more inflation. And the more inflation, the harder it becomes to save money, invest, and protect assets. Operation Photon knew this from the start. Internal reports showed that to maintain apparent stability, they needed to ensure 3 things: that the population blames governments, not the mechanism; that inflation seems to be a consequence of external factors, never the system itself; that financial education never explains fractional reserve. Simply, the auditor found a memo where Helena Moreau wrote, "If people understand that savings are destroyed by synthetic liquidity, we will have social panic." Panic is the word that appears in almost every report, because if the population realized that their money is diluted by artificial creation, they would stop trusting the banking system. And confidence is what keeps the system alive. Another document detailed how the mechanism affects the labor market. With more money artificially circulating, companies adjust prices, salary increases do not keep up with real inflation, and workers start to live by chasing after a value that always loses strength. You work more, produce more, deliver more, but you buy less. It is as if an invisible part of your salary is automatically removed before you receive it. It does not appear as a fee, it does not appear as a tax, it does not appear as a discount, but it is there, hidden in the very price of things. Fractional reserve also affects retirements. Pension funds rely on investments that lose value when there is too much liquidity. So, to avoid losses, funds take more risks, and they take more risks because they need to compensate for the effect of inflation generated by the system itself. This creates a kind of vicious cycle. If the system creates too much money, your retirement is worth less. If it creates too little, the market locks up. In other words, the system depends on harming you to function. But perhaps the most dangerous impact is on politics. Governments can become indebted indefinitely because they can always borrow money that does not exist. This means that politicians make trillions of decisions based on liquidity that has no backing. And when the mistakes appear, crises, recessions, high inflation, they blame anything but the central mechanism that made it all possible. Operation Photon calls this narrative protection. A cold term to hide the truth, monetary multiplication has transformed politics into a game of economic makeup. And then there was the most terrifying passage from the document, Photon Impact 2016. If the system were revealed, there would be mass withdrawal, collapse of confidence, and general breakdown. The mechanism must remain invisible. That was it. The entire fractional reserve structure is not sustained because it is efficient. It is sustained because it is invisible. The auditor finally understood what was happening. It was not the economy that was broken, it was you. Or rather, it was your relationship with money that was being broken in silence, while banks multiplied figures that never existed. And the segment ends with the inevitable question: if almost all of your money is created artificially, what value truly remains in what you save, invest, and work to earn? The auditor thought he had seen everything until he opened the final Operation Photon folder. It was called Photon Prime Maximum Directives, and it contained documents that were not reports, minutes, or technical studies. They were instructions, almost scripts, written as if they determined the future of world money. And right on the first page, there was a phrase that changed everything he knew about economics, inflation, banks, and even the role of governments. Money does not represent wealth. Money represents behavior. This sentence was highlighted in red as if marking the exact point where Operation Photon ceased to be just a network for protecting fractional reserve and became something much larger, a clandestine mechanism responsible not only for multiplying money, but for shaping the way billions of people make decisions. The next document was even more disturbing. It was called Sensory Framework 2021-2024 and described the true purpose of Operation Photon: to ensure that money created out of nothing not only circulates without being questioned, but is also perceived as inevitably necessary. To do this, they used 4 layers of influence: economic, narrative, articles, interviews, experts, and independent institutes, repeating that inflation is normal, natural, inevitable; emotional expectation, shaping the collective feeling that prices always rise, even when there is no real reason; technological flow, algorithms that reinforce financial concerns to direct consumer behavior; structural dependence, governments that need to indebt themselves to maintain benefits, works, and programs, and therefore cannot abandon monetary multiplication. But there was more. much more. Among the papers was a memo signed by Helena Moreau titled Windows of Public Acceptance. It precisely described the emotional phases that a population goes through when exposed to constant inflation. Denial, it's just an adjustment. Discomfort, things seem more expensive, but it must be global. Normalization, every country goes through this. Helplessness, there's nothing to be done. Conformity, better to work harder and try to keep up. And next to these steps, there was a note in black ink, probably from Victor Reinhardt. As long as there is conformity, multiplication is infinite. But the deadliest document was called the Expository Report, Confidential Photon Prime, which revealed the true dimension of the system, not as an economic phenomenon, but as a mechanism of global control. The auditor read in absolute silence. Money created out of nothing does not just finance consumption, it finances political stability, national narratives, and international alliances. It was the first time he had found such a direct explanation. Fractional reserve did not exist merely to stimulate the economy. It existed to build a global emotional bubble where entire countries believe they are prospering, when in fact they are merely being maintained in a permanent flow of artificial liquidity. Another paragraph detailed how crises are used as structural resets. Crises allow for the expansion of liquidity without public resistance. Fear legitimizes the trick. And then came the most terrifying revelation of all. The document affirmed that Operation Photon had its own risk metric, something called the Monetary Dissidence Index, MDI. It literally measured the level of public comprehension of the fractional reserve. If the MDI rose too much, the operation would activate correction mechanisms, dispersion of narratives, increase in technical noise, media focus on parallel topics, stimulation of superficial debates, and, if necessary, controlled creation of economic villains to divert attention. But the central point of the chapter was on the last page, a meeting described as Photon Prime Restricted Session, held in London in 2022. The 5 original members were present, and the document summarized the final conversation between them. Cole, the world cannot know that wealth and money are not the same thing. Tanaka, if they understand that, all liquidity collapses. Moreau, and governments lose power. Mertens, and banks lose credibility. Reinhardt, and we lose control. Cole, then let it remain so, invisible, fundamental, unquestionable. And the last sentence, written as the official conclusion of the meeting, left the auditor immobile for several minutes. The trick only works because no one realizes it's a trick. The chapter ends exactly here, with the revelation that Operation Photon does not protect banks, but protects the illusion necessary to keep the planet functioning. The auditor closed the last Operation Photon document with trembling hands, not because of the content, but because of the certainty that all of this had been happening for decades, right before everyone's eyes, without anyone noticing. He understood that he couldn't take down the system. No one can, but he also understood something even more important. You don't need to take down the system to regain freedom. You just need to leave it emotionally. And this is where everything comes back to you. As you watch this, whether from Brazil, Portugal, the United States, Japan, Angola, or anywhere else in the world, you need to understand one thing that has never been said directly. The modern financial system is not a physical prison, it is an emotional prison. It only works because you believe you have no alternative, because you have been conditioned to think that prices always rise, that inflation is natural, that financing is normal, that debt is routine, and that saving is almost impossible. All of this is part of the narrative that Operation Photon helped to build. But there is a way out. Not a revolutionary or fantastical way out, a silent, individual, and practical way out. A way out that does not depend on any bank, government, or institution. A way out that begins with 3 simple decisions. saving value, decentralizing risks, and stopping reliance on money born out of nothing. The auditor, after everything he saw, began to study what truly preserves value, and he noticed something that Operation Photon's own documents implied: everything that cannot be artificially created resists monetary multiplication. That's when he found the list of protection assets used internally by the operation's own members. They were not stocks, they were not bonds, they were not funds, and definitely they were not government digital currencies. The list included physical gold stored outside the banking system, productive land, always valued regardless of cycles, small, real businesses, not dependent on cheap credit, international diversification to escape local policies, practical skills which do not suffer inflation, and networks of people, the oldest form of protection. None of this depends on emotional trust in the system. None of this collapses if banks multiply money indefinitely. None of this disappears if inflation corrodes the currency. And this is where the biggest revelation emerges. Operation Photon does not control what cannot be printed. It only controls what depends on the trick. The auditor also discovered another thing that the documents revealed, even if indirectly. The simpler your financial life, the harder it is to be manipulated. The system does not know how to deal with those who have little borrowing, little credit, few debts, and little exposure to artificial narratives. And while analyzing everything, he noticed a sentence written on the margin of the Photon Prime report, a phrase scribbled by someone who clearly disagreed with the operation. They control the money, but they don't control the discipline. It was almost a message of internal resistance, a reminder that the system only works because everyone believes there is no way out. But there is, and it begins with individual choices, not with collective revolutions. It was at that moment that the auditor understood why Operation Photon is so afraid that the population will comprehend the mechanism. When you understand how it works, you stop playing the game. You begin to build real reserves, real value, real independence. And emotionally independent people are the greatest threat to the belief mechanism that sustains the entire architecture of infinite liquidity. The auditor decided to resign from his position, not to run away, but to no longer be part of the mechanism. He isolated himself for months, organized his finances, bought real assets, and wrote an anonymous report warning anyone who could find it. A report that ended with a simple yet devastating sentence: if they depend on your belief, then your disbelief is your greatest weapon. And that's how everything comes back to the beginning. The incident that morning, the inconsistent statement that opened the door to the entire investigation, now made sense. It was not a technical error. It was the flaw that revealed the architecture. And it was this flaw that brought you here. Now you know. Now you understand. And now, aware of the trick, you carry within you something that Operation Photon has never been: able to control, the capacity to decide, the capacity to resist, the capacity to disbelieve what was made to be invisible. Because in the end, no matter how much power banks, governments, and institutions have, the truth remains simple and unbeatable. They have the control, but we have the awareness. And awareness is what cannot be multiplied. Share this while you still can.